Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. So obviously, there's been a lot of talk in recent weeks about what we should do in terms of gun control, stopping mass shootings. Joining us on the line to discuss is Amy Swearer. She's the senior legal policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. She's co-published an extensive multi-part Heritage report record on the intersection of mental illness, violence, and firearms. Amy, thanks so much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show.
Ben, thank you for having me.
So, Amy, what were the chief findings on the causes of mass shootings, since it's sort of a weird data point, right? It's easier to see the causes of crime across the United States more broadly, but mass shootings are these sporadic events. So what were the findings?
Right. So when we look at mass shootings, we find that just like all forms of gun violence, they're fairly complicated, but there are some patterns that come up again and again. And one of those is the intersection of untreated serious mental illness. So studies have repeatedly shown, studies of mass public shooters in particular, that these individuals often have untreated diagnosable mental illness. So things like schizophrenia or major depression or some sort of major psychiatric history. And depending on the study and how they're defining it, it's anywhere from a quarter to 2/3 of these mass public shooters.
Well, that does suggest that maybe gun control is not the answer in all of this. What would be some of the policy prescriptions to deal with the mental illness intersection with mass shootings?
So one of the things that we know is the role of deinstitutionalization and how that has played a role in this sort of epidemic of untreated mental illness in the United States. So we started moving people out of psychiatric inpatient hospitals, but we didn't have outpatient settings for them. And so we just essentially haven't had the infrastructure to treat people. And at the same time, we've made it harder within our own laws to forcibly medicate or treat people who are becoming dangerous, who are mentally ill, but who are refusing treatment for themselves. So it's kind of been a combination of those things. And so policy prescriptions have to look at treating that underlying mental illness prior to the point where people are reaching mental health crises or becoming dangerous.
Well, when we speak about that, one of the big areas of study recently has been the idea that there's sort of a contagion of mass shootings, that we reach these tipping points where the media are covering these things, and that people who are mentally vulnerable to wanting to do this sort of stuff see the media coverage and then react based on that. What does your research show about the contagion theory of mass shootings?
So there is a relationship between the publicity that these shooters are getting, and it kind of lowers the threshold for the next shooter who may be kind of leaning that way and already prone toward violence. It just kind of it has the tendency to push them over the edge because, again, we're generally dealing with individuals who are not mentally stable. They're not in good places emotionally. And so this type of publicity really plays into a lot of the underlying problems they're already experiencing.
So, Amy, it seems like a lot of this research has already been pretty well formulated with regard to mental illness in particular, and yet every time there's a mass shooting, the talk immediately turns to gun control. It seems like it'd be very difficult to actually come up with an answer on the gun control front that actually does achieve the policy ends that are being recommended. What do you make of the push for red flag laws and gun violence restraining orders that allow near relatives to report somebody who may be a danger to themselves or others and then prevent them from accessing guns?
So red flag laws in particular are designed to sort of reach not necessarily a loophole, but we've reached at this point with a lot of our laws where we know these mass public shooters have long, troubling histories of indications that they are dangerous to themselves, dangerous to others. But what's happening is they're not reaching a point yet where they've already committed a crime or can be involuntarily committed. And so they're just kind of floating beneath the surface of having a disqualifying history. So they go in and they are actually able to purchase their firearms legally. They're passing background checks. And red flag laws are designed to identify and target those individuals who we know are dangerous but haven't quite reached that tipping point, to allow a court to adjudicate them as being dangerous, even if they're not mentally ill, even if they're not necessarily in crisis mode. And so there is a role for those laws to play, but there are very serious concerns about due process, about ensuring that these are not utilized to disarm political opponents, and that they're not used in sort of a broad, sweeping, abusive way.
Now, with all of that said, one of the sort of talking points that comes out in the aftermath of mass shootings is always cultural impact, video games, movies. Did your research show anything about correlation between those sorts of concerns and mass shootings?
No. I mean, so this is a talking point that keeps coming up, this relationship between mass shooters and video game violence. There is something to be said about an underlying societal bent toward violence, but in terms of individuals and how that drives them, there really is not any meaningful connection between individuals who play video games and then those who become mass shooters. So it's really a case of there are much more meaningful things that we can look at, and it kind of distracts people from, I think, more effective avenues of addressing mass shootings.
Well, Amy, policy analyst at Heritage Foundation. Go check out her study over at heritage.org. Amy, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Meanwhile,